This month, the Bureau of Reclamation reported a dangerous operating signal at Lake Powell. Inflow forecasts remained far below average, while managers worked to protect Glen Canyon Dam from approaching its critical power elevation. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. Seasonal runoff projections have weakened. Monthly inflow estimates have fallen even further. Planned releases from Lake Powell have been reduced. And drought response tools are being used to preserve a narrow band of elevation above minimum power pool. Taken together, these signals describe more than a shrinking reservoir. They describe a system losing water, power potential, and operating margin at the same time. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline number is 3,490 feet, the approximate elevation known as minimum power pool. The hidden number is the amount of water the dam can still move through its turbines as hydraulic head declines and the machines approach the lower edge of their operating range. This is not just a reservoir threshold. This is a controlled flow capacity test. Glen Canyon Dam can remain above the official line while producing less electricity, operating with fewer efficient choices, and moving closer to a future in which more of the release burden falls on a smaller set of outlet structures. So the question is no longer simply whether Lake Powell reaches minimum power pool. The question is, how much flexibility remains before the dam loses one of its most valuable pathways for moving water through the Colorado River system? Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because the most important signal may not be the lake level on the map. It may be the flow still available through the dam. At the start of the operating day, the first warning does not appear as a siren. It appears as a revised line on a federal projection. The Bureau of Reclamation updates the expected path of Lake Powell, and that line now bends toward an elevation the system was never meant to approach casually. In the June 2026 24-month study, managers were no longer working with the release plan established the previous summer. The original operating decision had called for 7.48 million acre-feet to pass through Glen Canyon Dam during the water year. The updated plan showed 6 million acre-feet. That is a reduction of nearly 1.5 million acre-feet, enough water to cover roughly 1.5 million acres with 1 foot of water. It is not a small correction at the edge of a forecast. It is a deliberate attempt to slow the decline of the reservoir. And before the morning data has finished loading, a second signal is already visible. The amount of water expected to arrive from the upper Colorado River basin has fallen sharply below what the system normally receives. Snow remains visible in the mountains, rivers are still moving, and Lake Powell may even rise temporarily during the runoff season. But the seasonal pulse is not delivering enough volume to rebuild the margin that matters. The reservoir can rise in early summer and still be on a dangerous annual trajectory. That is the first, unusual detail. A rising lake does not always mean a recovering system. On their own, these signals could be treated separately. A weak runoff year is a hydrology problem. A reduced dam release is an operating decision. A transfer from an upstream reservoir is a drought response action. A lower hydropower forecast is an electricity issue. Together, they describe one larger configuration. The Colorado River system is trying to preserve the same water inside Lake Powell for several different purposes at once. That water must provide elevation. It must create pressure behind the turbines. It must support power generation. It must remain available for future releases. And eventually, it must continue downstream toward Lake Mead and the communities, farms, industries, tribes, and ecosystems that depend on the river below. The control room is therefore not watching one reservoir. It is watching a set of promises that all occupy the same column of water. The official dashboard begins with elevation. Lake Powell is measured against full pool at 3,700 feet, a level the reservoir has not approached in years. Far below that is the target elevation of 3,525 feet, maintained as a buffer during drought response operations. 35 feet beneath that target sits minimum power pool, approximately 3,490 feet. The difference looks modest on a vertical scale. On an operating scale, It is the space in which managers are trying to protect one of the dam's most important functions. Below minimum power pool, Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower through its turbines in the normal way, and its ability to release water becomes more constrained. But the dashboard does not stop at elevation. Operators also watch storage, inflow, release volume, turbine capacity, unit availability, downstream demand, and the amount of power the plant can produce from each unit of water. Every one of those numbers is connected, but they do not move at the same speed. Inflow can collapse before the lake surface responds. Hydropower production can weaken before the reservoir reaches the official threshold. Release decisions can preserve elevation at Powell while reducing the amount of water reaching Mead. A temporary summer rise can hide a projected winter decline. That mismatch in timing is what makes the room difficult to read. The map shows a reservoir. The operators see a sequence. First comes snowpack, then temperature, then runoff efficiency, then river inflow, then storage, then elevation, then hydraulic head, then turbine output, then the remaining choices for moving water through the dam. By the time the public notices the last number, the earlier numbers may have been deteriorating for months. At another workstation, the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center is tracking the water before it reaches the reservoir. Forecasters are not simply measuring how much snow is left on a mountain. They are estimating how much of that snow will become river flow. That distinction has become increasingly important. Snow can melt into dry soil. Water can be absorbed by vegetation. Warm conditions can increase losses before runoff reaches the main channel. A basin can hold a visible snowpack and still deliver disappointing inflow. The snow map can look better than the reservoir forecast because the missing water is being removed along the route. This is why one number on a mountain cannot settle the question at the dam. The system must follow the water all the way downhill. Meanwhile, the Western Area Power Administration is looking at the same reservoir through an electrical lens. Glen Canyon Dam has 8 generating units, but the value of those units depends on the water pushing through them. When the lake is high, gravity provides greater hydraulic head. More pressure is available to turn the turbines, and each unit of water can produce more electricity. When the lake falls, the same release carries less energy. The plant can continue operating, but its flexibility and output shrink. That loss matters because Glen Canyon Power is not only a block of electricity, it is a controllable resource that can respond to changes in demand, help balance the regional grid, and support customers across several western states. When its production falls, replacement electricity must come from somewhere else, often at a different price and with different operating characteristics. The reservoir dashboard is therefore also an energy dashboard. Even though the warning first appears as a water elevation, farther upstream, managers examine Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo reservoirs. Under the Upper Basin Drought Response Operations Agreement, those reservoirs can be used to help protect critical elevations at Lake Powell. The language sounds technical, but the physical action is simple. Water stored in one place is released so that more water can reach another. Yet this does not create additional supply. It moves risk. Water sent from Flaming Gorge toward Powell is water no longer stored at Flaming Gorge. That can affect local recreation, hydropower, river conditions, future drought protection, and the amount of flexibility available to the upper basin later. In earlier emergency operations, hundreds of thousands of acre-feet were moved downstream to support Powell. In 2026, drought response planning returned because the projected margin had narrowed again. The reservoirs upstream had become part of Glen Canyon Dam's operating room. This is where the day becomes abnormal. The basin is not reacting to a single surprise. It is combining reduced releases, upstream support, revised forecasts, and emergency authority to protect a narrow elevation band. Each action buys something. A lower release preserves water in Powell. An upstream release adds water to Powell. A new forecast provides time to act. A hydropower adjustment reduces expectations before the machinery is forced to do so. But each action also transfers pressure. Holding water at Powell means less water moving toward Meade during that period. Drawing from an upstream reservoir reduces its own reserve. Producing less hydropower shifts demand toward other generators. Delaying the crossing of a threshold does not remove the dry conditions that push the system toward it. The dashboard is not showing a solution. It is showing a managed retreat from several limits at once. And there is another detail hidden inside the official projections. Different scenarios can produce very different futures from the same starting elevation. Under a more favorable inflow sequence, Lake Powell may remain above minimum power pool. Under a dry sequence, the reservoir can descend much faster. In April, Reclamation warned that without major intervention, a low inflow scenario could take Powell below 3,490 feet as early as August 2026. Later studies incorporated operational changes intended to protect the reservoir, including the reduced annual release. That does not mean the earlier warning disappeared. It means managers responded to it. The difference between the two projections is partly the difference made by intervention. This is why an updated forecast showing less immediate danger should not be read as proof that the original risk was exaggerated. It may show that the system spent water elsewhere, changed releases, or invoked emergency tools to keep the line from being crossed. A warning can become less likely because people act on it. The machinery below the lake adds another layer. Glen Canyon Dam normally moves much of its water through the power plant. Water enters intake structures, travels through large steel penstocks, turns turbine runners, generates electricity, and then continues downstream. If the reservoir falls too low for normal turbine operation, water must increasingly depend on other release pathways, including the river outlet works. Those outlets are essential, but they do not provide the same combination of power production, operating flexibility, and release capacity as the turbine system. The closer Powell moves toward minimum power pool, the more important the condition and capacity of those alternative pathways become. This is not because the dam suddenly stops existing at one elevation. It is because the number of useful options begins to narrow. The system can still move water, but the pathways are no longer equivalent. One produces electricity, another does not. One is built for routine power operations, another may be asked to carry a larger and more sustained burden. One provides broad control across multiple generating units. Another concentrates responsibility into fewer structures. That is why the room is watching more than the surface of the lake. Outside, the reservoir appears quiet. Boats move across the remaining channels. Rock walls show the pale mineral band left by higher water. The dam stands in the same place it has stood for decades. Inside the operating system, however, the day is crowded. Reclamation is revising the expected elevation. River forecasters are revising the inflow. Power marketers are revising the energy available. Reservoir operators are revising releases. Upper basin managers are deciding how much support can be provided without weakening another part of the system. Downstream users are watching what those decisions mean for Lake Meade. None of these institutions is responding to a separate story. They are responding to the same missing water at different points along its path. The unusual pattern is not merely that Powell is low. Lake Powell has been low before. The unusual pattern is the repeated use of extraordinary tools to defend a critical operating range while the underlying supply remains uncertain. A system designed around large reservoirs and long planning horizons is being forced into shorter decisions, month by month, forecast by forecast, release by release. Each adjustment preserves time, but the next dry sequence can consume that time again. The warning lights are not all red. That would be easier to understand. Some are yellow, some have briefly improved, some indicate a risk that has been delayed rather than removed. The control room must distinguish recovery from temporary protection. That is harder, and it leads to the question that will define the rest of this story. Which number tells us when the dam is truly running out of margin? The public answer is the lake elevation, 3,490 feet. But that number is only the visible boundary. To understand what the system feels as it approaches that boundary, we have to examine what 1 foot of elevation means inside the dam, how much energy disappears as hydraulic head declines, and why the same acre-foot of water becomes less useful before the reservoir ever crosses the official line. 3,490 feet sounds like a measurement taken from a map, but inside Glen Canyon Dam, it marks the point where an entire operating pathway begins to disappear. The Bureau of Reclamation calls it minimum power pool. That name can be misleading. It does not mean Lake Powell is empty. It does not mean the Colorado River has stopped flowing. It does not even mean the dam has reached dead pool. The much lower elevation where gravity can no longer move more water through the dam than the river is delivering into the reservoir. Minimum power pool means something more immediate. It is the approximate elevation below which water can no longer enter the power plant penstocks and pass through the turbines in the normal way. The reservoir would still contain billions of gallons of water. The dam would still be standing. Water could still be released through lower outlets. But one of the system's largest, most flexible, and most valuable pathways would be gone. To understand why that matters, begin with the vertical scale. Lake Powell is considered full at an elevation of 3,700 feet above sea level. Minimum power pool sits 210 feet below that. In metric terms, the difference is roughly 64 meters, close to the height of a 20-story building. That comparison makes the decline sound enormous, and it is. But the more important comparison is the final 35 feet between the drought response target of 3,525 feet and minimum power pool. 35 feet is about 10.5 meters. In an office tower, that might represent only 3 floors. At Lake Powell, those 3 floors form a protective operating buffer for a dam that helps move water and power across much of the American Southwest. The number is not just elevation. It is operating time being compressed into a shrinking vertical space. This is where the geometry of the reservoir begins to matter. Lake Powell is not a straight-sided tank. It is a flooded network of canyons, shelves, channels, and slopes. When the water surface drops 1 foot, the amount of storage lost or gained depends on the shape of the basin at that elevation. A foot near the top of a broad reservoir may represent a very different volume from a foot lower down, where water is confined within narrower canyon walls. That is why elevation and storage cannot be treated as interchangeable. The public sees the lake move vertically. Operators must calculate what that movement means in acre-feet, release capacity, hydraulic pressure, and time. An acre-foot is the amount of water required to cover 1 acre of land to a depth of 1 foot. It equals roughly 326,000 gallons. 1 million acre-feet is therefore about 326 billion gallons. Lake Powell at full capacity can hold roughly 25 million acre-feet. But minimum power pool is not defined by how many gallons remain. It is defined by where those gallons sit in relation to the power plant intakes. Water above the intakes can be directed into the penstocks. Water below them cannot climb upward to enter those openings. The critical issue is not simply whether water exists. It is whether gravity can still place that water on the correct path. That path begins behind the dam. Water enters large intake structures and moves into steel penstocks embedded through the concrete. Each penstock carries water downward toward a turbine. The falling water pushes against the turbine runner, turning a generator that converts mechanical energy into electricity. After passing through the machinery, the water returns to the Colorado River below the dam. The process uses the same water for 2 purposes. It produces electricity, and it completes a downstream release. That combination is what makes the turbine pathway so valuable. The water is not consumed by hydropower, it continues downstream. But as it moves through the plant, it delivers energy that can support the regional electrical system and generate revenue used throughout the Colorado River storage project. The headline number therefore separates 2 different ways of moving the same water. Above minimum power pool, releases can pass through the turbines and produce electricity. Below it, releases must depend on the river outlet works, which bypass the generators. The water can continue downstream, but its electrical value is lost. And even before that line is crossed, the amount of energy available from each unit of water is already changing. Hydropower depends on flow and hydraulic head. Flow is the volume of water moving through the turbines over time. When Lake Powell is high, the water surface stands far above the turbines. Gravity provides more pressure, and each acre-foot passing through the plant carries more potential energy. As the reservoir falls, that vertical distance shrinks. The same amount of water can still move through the turbine, but it does less work on the way down. The plant must pass more water to produce the same amount of electricity or accept lower generation from the scheduled release. This is why the loss does not begin at 3,490 feet. It begins above it. The official threshold marks the end of normal hydropower operation. The weakening begins during the approach. Glen Canyon Power Plant contains 8 generating units with a total installed capacity of approximately 1,320 megawatts. That figure describes what the plant can produce under suitable operating conditions. It is not a promise that the plant can produce that amount at every reservoir elevation. Capacity on paper and output in practice are different numbers. Turbines have operating ranges. Generators require maintenance. Water releases are limited by environmental rules and downstream needs. Most importantly, low hydraulic head reduces how much power the machinery can extract from the flow. A plant with 8 turbines can therefore remain physically intact while losing part of its usable electrical strength. The machines have not disappeared. The force feeding them has weakened. Think of water descending through the dam as a heavy object moving downhill. Raise that object higher, and it has more potential energy before it falls. Lower its starting point, and the object may weigh exactly the same, but the fall can deliver less energy. Lake Powell is the starting height. The penstocks are the route downhill. The turbines are the machines collecting part of that energy. A lower reservoir shortens the fall. This is basic physics, but its consequences extend far beyond the power plant floor. Glen Canyon has historically produced around 4 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity in an average year, enough energy to compare with the annual use of hundreds of thousands of homes. That household comparison is useful, but it does not describe the plant's full role. Hydropower can respond rapidly to changes in demand. Operators can raise or lower generation more quickly than many thermal power stations. That makes the plant useful not only for supplying energy, but for balancing a grid where electricity must be produced at nearly the same moment it is consumed. When evening demand rises, when another generator suddenly fails, or when wind and solar output shift, controllable hydropower can help fill the difference. As Lake Powell falls, the region is not only losing total electrical production, it may also be losing a portion of a highly adjustable resource. The number is not just water being pulled out of position, it is flexibility being pulled out of the grid. The physical scale becomes clearer when the flow is converted into something familiar. 1 cubic foot per second equals about 7.5 gallons, moving past a point every second. 1,000 cubic feet per second is nearly 7,500 gallons each second. At large operating flows, millions of gallons can pass through Glen Canyon Power Plant within minutes. That sounds almost limitless until it is compared with the size of the Colorado River system and the volume of annual obligations downstream. The turbines are not merely spinning machines inside a concrete wall. They are major valves in a continental water delivery network. Their ability to pass water matters even when electricity is not the first concern. This is why minimum power pool is a water number disguised as an energy number. If turbine releases become unavailable, the dam must rely on the river outlet works. Glen Canyon Dam has 4 outlet tubes positioned lower than the power plant intakes. Together, under favorable hydraulic conditions, they can move a large volume of water downstream. But they are not identical replacements for 8 turbine pathways. They do not generate electricity. Their capacity also changes as the reservoir falls because the pressure pushing water through them declines. At very low elevations, even lower outlets pass less water than they can when the reservoir is high. The dam therefore faces 2 related losses. First, the power plant pathway disappears. Then, as the lake continues downward, the remaining outlet capacity can weaken as well. Minimum power pool is not the final limit. It is the beginning of a narrower operating corridor. That distinction appears in everyday life through consequences that are separated from the reservoir by hundreds of miles. A lower Lake Powell can mean less inexpensive federal hydropower available to utilities and public power customers. It can mean replacement electricity must be purchased from other sources. It can reduce revenue supporting dam operations, environmental programs, and portions of the wider storage project. It can make scheduled downstream releases more dependent on fewer pieces of infrastructure. It can complicate the balancing of water retained at Powell against water needed at Meade. No single household sees an elevation number arrive at the front door. It arrives divided into smaller effects: a changed power allocation, a higher replacement cost, a tighter operating schedule, or less flexibility during a period of extreme demand. The lake level is measured in feet. The consequences are measured in choices, and that is what makes 3,490 feet abnormal. It was not designed as a routine seasonal landmark. It is the lower boundary of a system built during a period when planners expected the reservoir to hold a far larger cushion. The dam began generating electricity in the 1960s, when Lake Powell was still filling. For decades, operators worked with hundreds of feet of usable water above the lower outlets. Today, drought response planning is organized around protecting a buffer only 35 feet above minimum power pool. The seasonal cycle has been pulled out of its old position. Spring runoff no longer guarantees recovery. A summer rise may be followed by a winter descent. A wet year can provide relief without restoring the long-term reserve. A dry year can erase several previous gains. One line on the reservoir wall now carries responsibilities that used to be spread across a much deeper column of water. But even this headline number does not reveal the full danger. Elevation tells operators where the surface is. It does not by itself reveal how efficiently the turbines are running, how much flow each unit can accept, how many generating units are available, or how rapidly the release pathway is losing value. 2 days can show nearly the same lake elevation while producing different amounts of electricity because flow schedules, turbine conditions, and hydraulic performance have changed. The visible number defines the boundary. The hidden number measures how the system is approaching it. And once that hidden number begins to move, the dam can lose capability long before the public sees Lake Powell cross the line. The number most people are watching is the elevation of Lake Powell. The number that may reveal the operating problem earlier is the amount of water Glen Canyon Dam can still move through its turbines, and how much useful power that flow can produce as the reservoir falls. Those are not the same measurement. Elevation describes the position of the lake surface. Turbine flow describes the volume of water passing through the power plant over time. Hydraulic head describes the vertical force available to drive that water through the machinery. Power output reflects what the plant can extract from the combination of flow and head. The public sees one line moving down a chart. Operators see several lines moving at different speeds. And it is the separation between those lines that changes the risk. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. Imagine 2 operating days at Glen Canyon Dam. On both days, the reservoir surface stands at nearly the same elevation. On the first day, all 8 generating units are available. The scheduled release fits within an efficient operating range, and the plant can move most of the required water through its turbines while producing valuable electricity. On the second day, 1 unit is unavailable for maintenance. Another is operating under a restriction. The reservoir is slightly lower, and the release schedule demands more flexibility than the remaining machines can provide efficiently. The elevation difference may be small enough to disappear on a public graph. The operating difference can be much larger. This is why minimum power pool cannot be understood as a single switch waiting at 3,490 feet. It is the end of a declining corridor, not the beginning of the problem. Long before the lake reaches that elevation, the power plant can produce less energy from the same amount of water. As hydraulic head falls, each gallon arrives at the turbine with less potential energy. Operators can sometimes compensate by passing more water, but only if the release schedule, turbine limits, downstream conditions, and available units allow it. They cannot simply open every gate without consequence. Glen Canyon Dam releases are shaped by annual water delivery requirements, monthly operating plans, environmental constraints, power demand, ramping limits, and the condition of the machinery. Water is valuable, but timing is also valuable. A cubic foot released at the wrong moment cannot automatically be recovered later. The hidden number is therefore not merely total turbine flow. It is usable turbine flow within the range where the power plant can still perform several jobs at once. It must move the required water. It must keep the generating units within acceptable operating conditions. It must respond to changes in electrical demand. It must avoid release patterns that create unacceptable effects downstream. And it must do all of that with less pressure as the reservoir falls. The closer Powell moves toward minimum power pool, the more difficult that combination can become. A turbine is not an empty pipe. It is a machine designed to operate within a particular relationship between head, flow, rotational speed, and electrical load. Glen Canyon uses large Francis turbines, a common design for medium to high head hydropower plants. Water enters around the turbine, is directed through adjustable guide vanes, turns the runner, and exits below. The guide vanes can regulate flow, but they cannot create pressure that the reservoir no longer provides. As head declines, the machine must operate farther from the conditions around which its performance was optimized. Efficiency can fall. Vibration can become more important. Unstable flow patterns can place additional stress on equipment. The risk is not that every turbine suddenly fails at the same elevation. The risk is that the safe and efficient operating envelope narrows. That narrowing is difficult to communicate because it does not produce one dramatic public number. It appears in curves, unit limits, maintenance decisions, and the growing difference between installed capacity and available generation. Glen Canyon Power Plant may still be described as a 1,320 megawatt facility, but that is its maximum combined physical capacity under favorable conditions near full reservoir elevation. It does not mean the plant can deliver 1,320 megawatts while Lake Powell is near minimum power pool. A nameplate remains fixed to the machinery. The water behind it does not. At lower elevations, the available capacity can be far smaller because the turbines receive less head. This is the abnormal pattern. The structure looks unchanged, while its effective strength is being reduced from the reservoir side. The same concrete dam can contain the same 8 generators, yet offer a different power plant every time the lake descends. That difference matters to Western Area Power Administration, which markets power from Glen Canyon and other Colorado River storage project facilities. Customers do not purchase the theoretical capacity stamped on the plant. They depend on the energy and capacity the system can actually deliver. According to the 2026 Drought Response Operations Plan, losing generation at Glen Canyon could remove roughly 65 to 80% of the power deliveries associated with the larger Colorado River storage project system under the conditions examined. That does not mean the Western grid would suddenly go dark. Glen Canyon is one resource inside a much larger electrical network, but replacement power would have to come from somewhere, and it may cost more, arrive with different constraints, or be less flexible during periods of high demand. The turbine signal, therefore, travels beyond the dam before the official threshold is crossed. A lower megawatt forecast can become a power purchasing decision. A power purchasing decision can become a higher cost for a utility. A higher cost can move into the budget of a tribal energy authority, an irrigation district, a rural cooperative, or a municipal customer. The lake surface falls in Arizona and Utah. The financial response can appear hundreds of miles away, yet electricity is only one half of the hidden number. The turbines are also the dam's primary routine pathway for releasing water. When water passes through a generating unit, it performs useful work and then continues into the Colorado River. If turbine operation becomes unavailable, the dam must rely more heavily on its 4 river outlet tubes. Those outlets sit lower in the dam and can continue passing water below minimum power pool, but their capacity is not constant. Like the turbines, they depend on hydraulic head. As Lake Powell falls, the pressure driving water through the outlets also falls. Their maximum discharge declines with elevation. The transition below minimum power pool, therefore, does not replace one full capacity pathway with another full capacity pathway. It replaces a broad power plant system with a smaller, non-generating route, whose performance also weakens as the reservoir descends. This is where turbine flow becomes a signal of something larger than hydropower. It measures how much of the dam's release burden still has access to the pathway, with the greatest combination of capacity, control, and economic value. As long as water can move through multiple generating units, operators can distribute flow, adjust output, schedule maintenance, and respond to changing conditions. When that pathway is lost, responsibility concentrates in 4 outlet tubes. If one outlet is unavailable, the remaining margin becomes smaller. If the reservoir continues falling, their combined capacity declines. If downstream requirements rise, while inflow remains weak, operators face fewer ways to satisfy competing demands. The weak signal is not merely reduced electricity, it is reduced redundancy. And redundancy is what allows a large system to absorb surprise. This is why a temporary increase in turbine flow can also be misread. More water moving through the power plant on a given day does not necessarily mean conditions are improving. It may reflect a higher scheduled release, increased electrical demand, or an operational experiment. A dam can generate more power for several hours, while the reservoir's long-term margin continues to deteriorate. The meaningful question is not whether the turbines are spinning today. It is how much flow they can accept across the expected range of elevations, how much power that flow can produce, and how many alternative pathways remain if one part of the system becomes unavailable. No single public dashboard captures all 3. They must be read together. Elevation shows where the reservoir is. Turbine discharge shows how water is moving through the dam. Generation shows how much energy the falling water still carries. Outlet capacity shows what remains if the turbine pathway is lost. The pattern becomes dangerous when those numbers begin converging toward the same conclusion. Less head, less efficient generation, less available capacity, greater dependence on lower outlets, less room for equipment failure, maintenance, forecast error, or another dry year. The headline is 3,490 feet. The real story is the disappearance of choices before that line is reached. And the first people to experience that disappearance may not be standing beside Lake Powell. They may be watching a power allocation change, planning a dam maintenance window, scheduling water for a farm, or calculating whether an upstream reservoir can surrender another portion of its own protection. To understand how the hidden number moves beyond the control room, the next step is to follow 1 acre-foot of water through the system, from a shrinking column behind the dam, through the turbine, into the power grid, and finally, into the decisions of the people who depend on both water and electricity. The mechanism begins far above Glen Canyon Dam, long before water reaches a turbine, and long before anyone sees a warning line on the reservoir chart. It begins in the mountains, where winter snow becomes stored water, then enters soil, tributaries, and the main stem of the Colorado River. From there, the mechanism moves downhill into Lake Powell, through the reservoir, into the intake structures, down the penstocks, across the turbine runners, and back into the river below the dam. By the time the loss becomes visible as reduced power or reduced release flexibility, the system has already been carrying the load for months. To understand why turbine flow is the real signal, it helps to follow the water through every stage of that path. The first stage is accumulation. Snowpack in the upper Colorado River basin acts like a seasonal reservoir spread across mountain ranges. During winter, storms deposit snow at high elevations. During spring and early summer, rising temperatures melt that snow and release water into the basin. But snow depth alone does not determine how much water reaches Lake Powell. The water must survive the journey. It can soak into dry soil. It can be taken up by vegetation. It can evaporate from the surface. It can enter groundwater and move more slowly than the forecast period. A mountain can appear white while the river remains weak. That is the first hidden mechanism. The basin does not deliver snow. It delivers the fraction of snow that becomes runoff. When soils are unusually dry, the landscape behaves like a sponge placed beneath the melting snow. Before streams rise, the ground must absorb water. Warm temperatures can accelerate melt while also increasing evaporation and plant demand. A rapid melt does not always create a strong reservoir recovery. It can produce a short pulse, followed by an early decline. The visible snow disappears, but the expected volume never arrives. By the time that shortfall reaches Lake Powell, it has already passed through thousands of square miles of terrain. The reservoir records the result, not the cause. The second stage is storage. Water entering Lake Powell spreads through a long network of flooded canyons. The reservoir stores that water vertically and horizontally, but its operating value depends heavily on elevation. Each additional foot above the power plant intakes increases the vertical distance between the lake surface and the turbines. That distance is hydraulic head. In simple terms, hydraulic head is the height of the water column available to create pressure. The higher the water surface stands above the turbine, the more energy gravity can deliver as the water falls. This does not require the reservoir to be full. It requires enough vertical separation between the source and the machinery. The mechanism is similar to water flowing from a tank on a rooftop. A faucet on the ground floor receives more pressure when the tank is high above it. Lower the tank, and the pressure falls even if the same amount of water remains inside. Lake Powell is the tank. Glen Canyon Power Plant sits below. The falling reservoir lowers the tank without moving the machinery. The third stage is intake. Water enters the power plant system through openings positioned on the upstream face of the dam. These openings feed large steel penstocks that carry water downward. The penstocks are not simply pipes connecting the reservoir to the river. They are controlled pressure pathways. Their diameter, shape, elevation, and connection to the turbine units determine how much water can move through the plant and under what conditions. As the reservoir declines, the water above the intake becomes shallower. The pressure at the entrance drops. The movement of water becomes less forceful. The plant can still operate, but the relationship between flow and power changes. The fourth stage is acceleration. Once water enters the penstock, gravity pulls it downward. The water gains speed and pressure as it approaches the turbine. In a high reservoir, the greater hydraulic head gives the water more potential energy to convert. In a low reservoir, the same gallon begins the descent from a lower point. It still moves downhill, but it brings less energy into the machine. This difference is small for 1 gallon and enormous across millions of gallons. Hydropower is produced by multiplying 3 main elements: the density of water, the rate of flow, and the effective head, adjusted for the efficiency of the machinery. The density of water does not change enough to rescue the plant. If head declines, operators must depend more heavily on flow and efficiency. But both have limits. Flow cannot be increased without regard to annual release plans, downstream conditions, and turbine design. Efficiency cannot remain constant when a machine is pushed away from the conditions for which it was built. The fifth stage is the turbine. Glen Canyon Dam uses Francis turbines, large machines designed to extract energy from moving water. Water enters around the edge of the turbine and is guided inward through adjustable gates. It strikes and flows across curved blades on the runner, causing the runner to rotate. The runner is connected by a shaft to a generator above. As the shaft turns, the generator produces electricity. The process sounds simple, but the flow inside the turbine is highly controlled. Water must arrive at the correct pressure, angle, and speed. The guide vanes must direct it evenly. The runner must turn at a stable speed synchronized with the electric grid. The water must exit smoothly into the draft tube below. When these conditions are balanced, the turbine operates efficiently. When head falls, that balance becomes harder to maintain. A lower head changes the speed and pressure distribution of the water inside the machine. Operators can adjust the guide vanes and electrical load, but the machine still has a preferred operating envelope. Outside that envelope, efficiency declines. More of the water's energy is lost as turbulence, vibration, and heat, rather than converted into electricity. The turbine continues spinning, but it produces less useful work from each unit of flow. This is where the hidden mechanism becomes measurable. Suppose two identical volumes of water pass through the dam on 2 different days. On the first day, Lake Powell is high enough to provide strong hydraulic head. On the second day, the reservoir is much lower. The same number of acre-feet may be released downstream, but the second release produces less electricity. The water obligation can be met while the energy value collapses. To a downstream gauge, the flows may appear similar. To the power plant, they are not. The water has completed the same geographic journey, but delivered less mechanical force along the way. That difference is what operators see before the public sees a threshold crossing. The 6th stage is cavitation risk. Cavitation occurs when pressure in part of a flowing liquid falls low enough for vapor bubbles to form. When those bubbles move into a higher pressure zone, they collapse violently. Each collapse is tiny, but repeated collapses can damage metal surfaces, create vibration, reduce efficiency, and shorten equipment life. Cavitation does not mean a turbine will suddenly explode when the reservoir reaches a certain elevation. It means that operating conditions matter. Low head, unfavorable flow, and off-design operation can increase the chance that damaging pressure patterns develop inside the turbine or draft tube. Engineers use operating limits to keep machines away from conditions where stress, vibration, or cavitation could become unacceptable. As Lake Powell falls, those limits can reduce the range of flow available through a turbine. The machine may still run, but not at every output level operators would prefer. This is why turbine flow is not simply the maximum amount of water that can fit through a pipe. It is the amount that can pass through a working machine while maintaining acceptable performance and equipment protection. The 7th stage is electrical conversion. The rotating turbine shaft turns a generator. Inside the generator, magnetic fields move relative to coils of wire, producing electrical current. That electricity enters transformers, transmission lines, and the wider western grid. The generator does not know why hydraulic head has fallen. It only receives less mechanical torque from the turbine. The result is lower available power. During periods of high demand, that loss can matter more than the annual energy total suggests. A hydropower plant can increase or decrease output quickly, which makes it valuable for balancing sudden changes across the grid. If a summer evening brings high air conditioning demand, if a thermal plant trips offline, or if wind generation falls faster than expected, Glen Canyon Power can help close the gap. But only if sufficient water, head, turbine capacity, and operating freedom are available at the same moment. A low reservoir reduces that freedom. The mechanism has now moved from mountain snow into an electrical control room. The 8th stage is discharge. After passing through the turbine, the water exits through a draft tube and returns to the Colorado River below the dam. It then moves toward Grand Canyon, Lake Mead, and the lower basin. The water has not been consumed. Hydropower has taken energy from its descent, not removed the water itself. This dual purpose is the central advantage of the turbine pathway. One release can produce electricity and satisfy downstream delivery. If the turbine pathway is lost, the same water may still be released through the river outlet works, but the electrical benefit disappears. The system must then choose between 2 less favorable conditions: hold the water in Powell to protect elevation, or release it downstream without generating power. Neither choice replaces the original combination. The 9th stage is the outlet transition. The river outlet works consist of lower tubes that bypass the turbines. They are essential because they allow water to pass through the dam when the power plant cannot carry the required release. But they are not a duplicate power plant hidden inside the concrete. They provide fewer pathways, no electricity, and a discharge capacity that also declines as hydraulic head falls. At a higher reservoir elevation, pressure can drive more water through each outlet. At a lower elevation, the same opening passes less. The mechanism that weakens the turbines, therefore, follows the system into the backup route. Falling head does not stop being important when water changes pipes. It weakens every gravity-driven release pathway. That is the deeper danger. The dam does not move from one strong system to another strong system. It moves from a weakening primary pathway to a more limited secondary pathway. By the time that transition becomes necessary, the reservoir has already lost most of the pressure that once made the entire structure flexible. The 10th stage is constraint. Every release decision begins to carry more consequences. Passing water through the turbines may preserve downstream delivery, but lower the reservoir. Holding water may protect hydraulic head, but reduce releases toward Lake Mead. Moving water from an upstream reservoir may support Powell, but weaken storage somewhere else. Purchasing replacement electricity may protect customers from an immediate shortfall, but increase costs. Delaying maintenance may preserve short-term generating capacity, but increase future equipment risk. None of these decisions occurs in isolation. The physical mechanism inside the dam creates administrative, financial, and environmental pressure outside it. This is why the phrase controlled flow capacity test matters. The test is not whether concrete can hold back water. The test is whether managers can continue placing the correct amount of water through the correct pathway at the correct time, while the force driving every pathway is shrinking. The mechanism begins above the basin. It moves into soil, rivers, storage, intakes, penstocks, turbines, generators, transmission lines, outlet tubes, and downstream obligations. Then it reaches people. By the time it becomes visible in a power bill, a water schedule, a maintenance decision, or a reduced release forecast, the system is already carrying load. And now the question becomes personal. What does this chain look like when it passes through one household, one utility worker, one farm, and one decision made during the hottest hours of the day? The body does not experience reservoir decline as a graph. It experiences it as a room that becomes harder to cool, a power bill that rises, a shift schedule that changes, a water delivery that arrives with less flexibility, or a decision that must be made before the next hot afternoon. To understand how the mechanism inside Glen Canyon Dam reaches a person, follow one family living in a small desert community, served by a public power utility that receives part of its electricity through the Colorado River storage project. Their home is modest. The air conditioner is old but functional. One adult works outdoors maintaining roads. Another works evening shifts at a regional clinic. A child sleeps in a bedroom that faces west and holds heat long after sunset. None of them watches turbine efficiency curves. None of them measures hydraulic head. But the hidden number at Glen Canyon Dam can still move through their day. It begins with weak runoff in the upper Colorado River basin. Less water reaches Lake Powell. The reservoir elevation falls. Hydraulic head declines. The turbines can extract less energy from each acre-foot of water. The amount of low-cost federal hydropower available to customers decreases. The local utility must then fill the difference. It may buy replacement electricity from the regional market. It may rely more heavily on contracts with other generators. It may delay other spending. It may adjust rates. The family does not receive a notice saying that Lake Powell has lost several feet of operating margin. They receive a monthly bill that is slightly harder to pay. That is how a reservoir enters a kitchen. At first, the increase may appear manageable. A few dollars can be absorbed by postponing a purchase. But during extreme summer heat, electricity use rises at the same moment. Replacement power becomes most valuable. Air conditioners across the region begin running longer. Demand increases in the late afternoon when buildings have accumulated heat, and solar generation is moving past its peak. Utilities need flexible power during exactly those hours. Hydropower is useful because it can respond quickly, yet Glen Canyon Dam may have less capacity to provide that response when the reservoir is low. The family's problem is therefore not only the total amount of electricity available over the year, it is whether affordable electricity is available during the hours when the body needs cooling most. The outdoor worker returns home with heat stored in muscles, skin, and internal tissues. The body has spent the day trying to maintain a safe temperature. Blood has moved toward the skin. Sweat has removed heat through evaporation. The heart has worked harder to support circulation. Recovery should begin after sunset, when the environment cools and the body can reduce its thermal load. But the bedroom remains hot. The walls release the heat they absorbed during the day. The roof continues radiating warmth downward. The air conditioner cycles for longer periods. If the family raises the thermostat to control the bill, the room may never become cool enough for full recovery. The body does not know that the decision began with a declining water column behind a dam. It only knows that the night is not giving back what the day took away. Poor sleep becomes the next step in the pathway. Heat can delay sleep, interrupt it, and reduce its restorative value. The worker wakes with less recovery before returning to a job that demands concentration near moving equipment and traffic. Fatigue affects reaction time. Heat stress affects judgment. A small financial decision made in the evening can become a safety risk the next morning. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside. The clinic worker experiences the same system from the other direction. On a hot evening, more patients arrive with dehydration, dizziness, breathing difficulty, cardiovascular stress, or complications from chronic illness. The clinic must maintain cooling, refrigeration for medicines, lighting, electronic records, and diagnostic equipment. It may have backup power, but backup systems are designed for outages, not for replacing an affordable regional power resource over an entire season. The clinic's electricity bill rises, along with everyone else's. Administrators must decide which expenses can be delayed. A maintenance project may wait. A vacant position may remain unfilled. Supplies may be ordered more carefully. The reduction in hydropower does not close the clinic by itself. That would be an exaggeration. But it can add pressure to a facility already carrying heat-related demand, staffing shortages, and higher operating costs. The mechanism from the reservoir does not create every problem. It joins them. That distinction matters. System risk is often produced not by one overwhelming force, but by several moderate loads arriving at the same place. The family also depends on water, though not necessarily from Lake Powell directly. Their community's pumps, treatment systems, wells, storage tanks, and distribution network all require electricity. If power costs rise, water utilities face higher operating expenses. If electricity supply tightens during extreme demand, operators may delay non-essential pumping or shift it to different hours. Most customers will still turn a tap and see water, but behind that ordinary action, schedules become more rigid. A pump that could once run when needed may now be operated when electricity is cheaper. A storage tank must carry more of the burden between pumping cycles. A mechanical failure becomes harder to absorb because there is less flexibility in both the energy system and the water system. This is how one hidden number can travel through two infrastructures at once, from reservoir elevation into turbine performance, from turbine performance into power procurement, from power procurement into pumping schedules, from pumping schedules into the reserve inside a local tank. The family sees only the tap and the bill. Operators see the shrinking margin behind both. Now follow another person, a power scheduler working for a utility that receives Glen Canyon Hydropower. Each day, that scheduler must match expected demand with available supply. The task is not simply to purchase enough electricity. The supply must arrive at the correct hour. Forecasts include temperature, cloud cover, wind output, solar generation, industrial demand, maintenance outages, and the availability of hydroelectric resources. A low Lake Powell changes the assumptions. The scheduler may receive less energy than expected from Glen Canyon, or less capacity during critical periods. That missing block must be replaced. Market prices can rise quickly during heat waves because many utilities are searching for the same replacement at the same time. The scheduler begins making decisions that ripple outward. Buy power earlier at a known price, or wait and risk a higher price. Use a more expensive contract, or preserve it for a later emergency. Schedule local generation, or accept the fuel and emissions costs. Ask large customers to reduce demand or carry less reserve. Each decision is rational on its own. Together, they reveal a system losing easy options. The scheduler does not control runoff. The turbine operator does not control regional heat. The family does not control market prices. But all three are connected by the same narrowing pathway. There is also a tribal utility manager serving remote customers across a wide territory. Transmission distances are long. Household incomes may be lower. Infrastructure investment has often lagged behind need. Federal hydropower can be especially valuable in this setting because stable, lower-cost electricity supports customers with little room for sudden increases. When Glen Canyon generation declines, replacement costs do not arrive in a place with unlimited financial reserves. They arrive where some families already choose between cooling, food, medicine, fuel, and debt. Again, the mechanism is not a direct one-to-one cause. A single low reservoir does not determine a single family's hardship, but it can remove one layer of protection. The loss of affordable hydropower matters most where the margin was already thin. This is the human version of minimum power pool. A household also has a minimum operating margin. It is the amount of money left after rent, food, transportation, medicine, and utilities. A clinic has one. A rural cooperative has one. A tribal authority has one. When the reservoir loses hydraulic head, those institutions can lose financial head. The physical pressure falls at the dam. The economic pressure rises downstream. The pathway continues into the farm. An irrigator receiving water from a system connected to the Colorado River depends on pumps, canals, schedules, and energy prices. Some water moves by gravity. Some must be lifted. Pumping costs increase when electricity costs increase. If water deliveries are reduced or shifted, the farmer must decide which field receives enough water and which one does not. Crops do not respond to annual averages. They respond to water during specific stages of growth. A delivery that arrives too late can be worth less than the same volume arriving at the right time. The same is true of electricity at Glen Canyon Dam. Timing converts supply into usefulness. A megawatt during a cool night is not identical to a megawatt during a hot evening peak. An acre-foot released without generating power is not identical to one that also supports the grid. A gallon delivered after a crop's critical growth stage is not identical to one delivered before. The entire system is built around timing, and low reservoir conditions reduce the ability to choose that timing. By now, the mechanism has passed through a mountain snowpack, dry soil, Lake Powell, a turbine, a power market, a utility office, a bedroom, a clinic, a pump, and a field. At every stage, the signal becomes less visible but more personal. No dramatic wall of water arrives. No single switch turns off the region. Instead, recovery weakens. Costs accumulate. Schedules tighten. Equipment works longer. People postpone maintenance. Families tolerate more heat. Workers begin the next day with less rest. The danger is not only the loss of power. It is the loss of flexibility repeated across thousands of small decisions. One family can absorb one higher bill. One clinic can absorb one expensive month. One utility can purchase replacement power. One farm can adjust one schedule. But what happens when the next dry year arrives before those systems recover? What happens when a heat wave increases demand at the same time hydropower capacity declines? What happens when one turbine is unavailable? One transmission line is constrained? One pump requires repair, and one household has already exhausted its savings? The human pathway reveals the real scale of the problem. Glen Canyon Dam does not need to stop operating for the consequences to begin. The reservoir only needs to reduce the value of each remaining option. And once the mechanism reaches the person, the next question is unavoidable. Which small piece of infrastructure carries the largest burden when the turbine pathway can no longer do what the system once assumed it would always do? The weak point is not the whole dam. The weak point is the small set of structures that must carry the release burden when the power plant can no longer do it. At Glen Canyon, That point is the river outlet works. 4 steel-lined tubes sit lower in the dam than the turbine intakes. Under normal conditions, they are not the main pathway for routine releases. The power plant performs that role because water can pass through 8 generating units, produce electricity, and continue downstream. The outlet tubes are there to provide another route. They can support releases when turbines are unavailable, help manage unusual operating conditions, and preserve a way to move water at elevations below minimum power pool. They are essential, but essential does not mean unlimited. It does not mean interchangeable, and it does not mean they were intended to carry every responsibility now concentrated around them for an extended period. To understand the weak point, imagine the dam as a building with several exits. Under ordinary conditions, most people leave through 8 wide doors. Those doors also perform another useful function every time they open. Now imagine that the floor slowly drops below the level of those doors. The building still has 4 lower exits, but the crowd has not become smaller. The same downstream obligations remain. The same need for control remains. The same possibility of maintenance or mechanical failure remains. What changes is the number of usable paths. The system has not lost all movement. It has lost redundancy. That is the detail that turns a low reservoir into an infrastructure test. Redundancy is the ability to lose one component without losing the entire function. With multiple turbines available, operators can distribute flow across units. One machine can be taken offline, while others continue operating. Flow can be adjusted in smaller increments. Electrical output can be shaped across the day. If a vibration appears in one unit, engineers have alternatives. If maintenance is needed, the plant can preserve at least part of its release and generating capability. When the turbine pathway disappears, all non-spillway releases must depend much more heavily on the 4 lower outlet tubes. 4 is not 0, but 4 is less than 12 potential pathways when the 8 turbines and 4 outlets are considered together, and the 4 remaining pathways do not produce power. The weak point is therefore not just their combined capacity. It is the concentration of several critical functions into equipment with fewer alternatives. Each river outlet tube carries water through the concrete dam and discharges it into the river below. At higher reservoir elevations, the pressure behind the water can drive a substantial flow through these tubes. As Lake Powell falls, that pressure declines. The same opening passes less water. This is a fundamental property of gravity-driven flow. Capacity is not a number permanently attached to the pipe. It is a relationship between the pipe and the water level behind it. A public document may list a large maximum outlet capacity, but that figure applies only under particular reservoir conditions. Near minimum power pool, the available discharge is lower. Farther down, it declines again. The weak point weakens at the same time. The system becomes more dependent on it. That is the dangerous alignment. The smaller root is being asked to carry more responsibility, while the force feeding it is shrinking. The first dependence is downstream water delivery. Lake Powell is not an isolated storage basin. Releases from Glen Canyon Dam move through Grand Canyon and into Lake Mead. Those releases are part of a larger legal and operating framework that supports users in Arizona, Nevada, California, Mexico, and tribal communities throughout the basin. Not every downstream demand must be met from a single day of flow, and managers can adjust timing within rules and agreements. But water must continue moving through the dam over the long term. If turbine releases are lost, the outlet works become the primary controlled pathway for fulfilling that movement. The question is no longer whether water exists in Powell. It is whether enough water can be passed through the remaining structures at the rate and timing the system requires. The second dependence is environmental. The Colorado River below Glen Canyon Dam is not simply a delivery canal. Flow changes affect water temperature, sediment movement, aquatic habitat, river stage, beaches, archaeological sites, and species throughout Grand Canyon. Operators use release patterns to balance multiple objectives, including hydropower, downstream conditions, and environmental requirements. Turbines allow flow to be divided across several units and adjusted with precision. Outlet tubes can also be controlled, but a system relying on fewer openings may have less flexibility. A smaller number of pathways can make each adjustment larger, each maintenance event more consequential, and each unexpected problem harder to absorb. The weak point does not need to fail completely to reduce environmental control. It only needs to narrow the range of choices. The third dependence is power replacement. Below minimum power pool, every acre-foot released through the outlet works bypasses the generators. The water still travels downstream, but the energy is lost. This means the outlet tubes solve only part of the problem. They preserve water movement while transferring the electrical burden elsewhere. Utilities must replace the missing hydropower. Other generators must increase output. Market purchases may rise. Transmission paths may carry different flows. During mild conditions, the system may absorb that change without visible disruption. During an extreme heat event, a wildfire affecting transmission, or an outage at another power plant, the absence of Glen Canyon generation can matter more. The outlet works keep the river moving. They do not keep the grid whole. This is why the phrase backup pathway can be misleading. A backup should reproduce the critical function of the primary system. These outlets reproduce only the water release function. They do not reproduce hydropower, full flexibility, or the same level of redundancy. The fourth dependence is maintenance. Infrastructure does not become immune to wear because it is needed more urgently. Gates, valves, coatings, steel liners, seals, sensors, control systems, and downstream structures all require inspection and repair. A component that normally operates intermittently may face different stress when used more frequently or for longer durations. Flow creates vibration. High-velocity water can damage surfaces. Changes in pressure can affect performance. Debris, corrosion, or mechanical wear can reduce reliability. Engineers manage these risks through maintenance schedules and operating limits. But maintenance itself requires margin. If one outlet tube must be taken offline while turbines are unavailable, the remaining 3 must carry the release. If 2 are restricted, the margin narrows further. The system becomes sensitive to events that would once have been manageable. A single gate problem does not need to threaten the entire dam. It only needs to occur when there are too few alternative routes. The weak point is not defined by the probability of one catastrophic failure. It is defined by the consequence of ordinary maintenance in an extraordinary operating condition. The fifth dependence is forecast accuracy. When many release pathways are available, operators have room to respond if inflow is lower than expected or downstream requirements change. When only a few pathways remain, timing becomes harder. Hold too much water to protect elevation, and Lake Mead receives less. Release too much, and Powell descends more quickly toward lower capacity. A forecast error of several 100,000 acre-feet can alter the balance. Warm weather can accelerate snowmelt. Dry soils can consume more water than models expected. A monsoon can add local moisture without rebuilding upper basin storage. Forecasting is not failure, it is uncertainty. But infrastructure becomes vulnerable when it requires increasingly precise forecasts to avoid increasingly narrow limits. A system with margin can survive being wrong. A system near a bottleneck must be right more often. The sixth dependence is emergency response. Suppose a large wildfire damages a transmission corridor while regional electricity demand is high. Under normal reservoir conditions, Glen Canyon Hydropower might help replace part of the lost generation or support grid balancing. Near minimum power pool, that option is reduced. Suppose a mechanical issue appears in one outlet gate during the same period. Water releases can continue, but through fewer structures. Suppose downstream managers also need a change in flow to support water operations or environmental conditions. Each event is manageable by itself. Together, they form a compound load. This is how infrastructure systems often break, not because every component fails, but because one small component becomes the meeting point for several problems that were planned separately. The dam is designed for water. The grid is designed for electricity. Reservoir agreements are designed for allocation. Environmental programs are designed for river conditions. Maintenance plans are designed for machinery. At low elevation, the outlet works become the place where all of those schedules collide. The weak point is therefore physical and institutional at the same time. Physically, 4 tubes may become the primary route for controlled releases. Institutionally, many agencies and users depend on those tubes for different reasons. Reclamation needs release capacity. Western power customers need replacement planning. Lower basin users need continued deliveries. Environmental managers need controllable flows. Upstream states need to know how much water must be preserved or moved. Tribal communities need certainty in systems that have often provided too little of it. Each group sees a different risk, but the same steel structures sit beneath all of them. That concentration is what makes the outlet works more than an engineering detail. They become a point where legal promises, energy planning, and river physics are forced through a limited opening. There is also a lower limit beneath the weak point. Minimum power pool is not dead pool. Water can continue to pass through the outlet works below the turbine threshold, but as the reservoir descends toward the lowest outlet elevations, the capacity to move water declines further. Eventually, the system approaches a condition where the dam may be unable to release water at the rates historically expected, even while some water remains trapped behind it. This distinction is critical. A reservoir can hold water that is not fully accessible through existing infrastructure. Storage on paper is not the same as controllable delivery. The remaining water may sit below the most useful openings. At that point, the weak point is no longer only the outlet tube. It is the elevation relationship between the water and every available outlet. The system begins to lose not just power, but command over the reservoir itself. That outcome is not inevitable. Managers can reduce releases, move water from upstream reservoirs, adjust annual operations, and pursue conservation throughout the basin. Wet years can rebuild elevation. Infrastructure can be modified. Operating rules can change. The evidence does not support claiming that Glen Canyon Dam is certain to lose control of releases on a fixed date. But the warning does not require certainty. The existing configuration already shows why the risk is real. The primary release pathway depends on a reservoir approaching its lower operating range. The secondary pathway has fewer structures, no generating capability, and declining capacity as water falls. Upstream support is limited. Downstream obligations remain. The system is being asked to defend a smaller margin with tools that become weaker as the margin shrinks. The weak point is not the entire Colorado River. It is not every turbine, every transmission line, or every reservoir. It is 4 controlled openings in one concrete wall. Openings that may be asked to replace a power plant, maintain downstream flow, absorb forecast errors, survive maintenance, and preserve flexibility at the same time. If those tubes become the main pathway, the system does not immediately collapse. It becomes less forgiving. One unavailable component matters more. One dry forecast matters more. One additional demand matters more. One lost foot of hydraulic head matters more. And that is why the next chapter cannot begin with a hypothetical future. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. Glen Canyon Dam has faced moments when water was too low for comfort and moments when water was too high for control. Those events moved in opposite directions, but both exposed the same truth. A dam is safest when it has several ways to move water. When those choices narrow, even a small structure can begin carrying the weight of an entire river system. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. In fact, Glen Canyon Dam has faced 2 operating crises that moved in opposite directions. One came from too little water. The other came from too much. They were separated by nearly 4 decades, and they stressed different parts of the structure, but both exposed the same weakness. A dam is not protected by concrete alone. It is protected by options. It needs enough storage, enough release capacity, enough functioning equipment, and enough time for operators to move water before conditions remove those choices. The more recent precedent began as a slow decline. From 2000 through the early 2020s, the Colorado River Basin experienced a long period of drought, interrupted by only limited recovery. Lake Powell descended through elevations that had once been treated as distant planning scenarios. The pale mineral line on the canyon walls grew taller. Boat ramps closed or had to be extended. Intake systems were modified. Hydropower production weakened. Each change looked local, but together they showed the reservoir moving out of the operating range around which much of the system had been built. By 2021, federal managers were no longer discussing only future risk. They were using emergency tools to protect Lake Powell from approaching minimum power pool. Under drought response operations, water was released from upstream Colorado River Storage Project reservoirs. Flaming Gorge in Wyoming and Utah became the largest source of that support. Water stored hundreds of miles upstream was sent down the Green River, through its confluence with the Colorado, and eventually into Lake Powell. The action helped preserve elevation behind Glen Canyon Dam, but it also demonstrated the scale of the problem. The system was using one reservoir's reserve to protect another reservoir's operating machinery. In 2022, the response became even more direct. The Bureau of Reclamation reduced releases from Glen Canyon Dam and combined that reduction with drought response water from upstream reservoirs. According to Reclamation, those actions preserved approximately 1 million acre-feet of additional water in Lake Powell. 1 million acre-feet is roughly 326 billion gallons. That volume did not arrive because the basin suddenly became wetter. It remained in Powell because managers changed where water was stored and when it moved downstream. The lake elevation reflected intervention, not natural recovery. This distinction is essential. A reservoir can stabilize because runoff improves. It can also stabilize because operators spend flexibility elsewhere. On a public chart, both outcomes can look like a line that stops falling. Inside the system, they are not equivalent. Natural recovery adds supply. Emergency operations redistribute scarcity. The 2022 actions protected the turbine pathway, but they transferred pressure upstream and downstream. Flaming Gorge surrendered water that could have supported its own future operations. Lake Mead received less water from Powell during the adjustment. Power production remained constrained because the reservoir was still low. The system gained time, but it did not erase the imbalance that made the action necessary. That same water year produced another important piece of evidence. Hydropower generation at Glen Canyon fell to a record low of about 2.59 million megawatt-hours. The plant did not stop. The turbines continued turning. Water continued moving downstream, but the amount of electricity produced had declined sharply because less water and lower hydraulic head reduced the energy available to the machines. This was the hidden number becoming visible. Lake Powell had not crossed minimum power pool, yet the power plant was already losing performance. The threshold remained below the reservoir. The consequences had moved above it. Then came the winter of 2022 and 2023. Snow accumulated across much of the upper Colorado River Basin. Spring runoff improved. Lake Powell rose dramatically from its low point. And updated federal modeling showed that the immediate risk of reaching critical elevations had been substantially reduced. That recovery mattered. It rebuilt part of the operating margin and increased hydropower production during water year 2023. But it did not return the reservoir to the conditions that existed before the long decline. One strong runoff season changed the near-term forecast. It did not restore the historical baseline. The precedent, therefore, contains two lessons, not one. The first is that emergency action can work. Reduced releases and upstream support can protect critical elevations. The second is that successful intervention can be mistaken for permanent repair. A system may avoid the threshold because managers acted, then approach it again when dry conditions return. The warning is not invalidated by the rescue. The rescue proves the warning was operationally important. There was another sign of how far the low water problem had traveled. The city of Page, Arizona, and the Lecce chapter of the Navajo Nation depend on infrastructure connected to Lake Powell for municipal water. As the reservoir declined, the existing intake configuration faced a lower limit. Reclamation crews completed a new connection designed to maintain water delivery even if Powell fell to approximately 3,370 feet, the elevation commonly associated with dead pool. That project did not mean dead pool was certain. It meant the risk had become credible enough to justify modifying physical infrastructure before the water reached it. A forecast had entered a pipe. A declining reservoir had moved from federal modeling into the drinking water system of real communities. That is what historical evidence looks like before disaster. It often appears as an expensive adaptation completed just in time. The low water precedent shows a system losing force gradually. The second precedent shows what happens when force arrives too quickly. In 1983, Glen Canyon Dam faced an unusually large runoff following changing weather conditions and forecasts that did not fully capture what was coming. Lake Powell rose toward full capacity. The power plant and river outlet works could not pass enough water by themselves to control the reservoir. Operators had to use the dam's two large spillway tunnels, one through each canyon wall. These tunnels were designed for rare conditions when inflow exceeded the combined capacity of the normal release structures. They offered another pathway. That pathway prevented the reservoir from simply overtopping the dam, but it contained a hidden vulnerability. Water accelerated through the spillway tunnels at enormous speed, at flows of roughly 30,000 cubic feet per second. Severe cavitation and erosion developed inside both tunnels. Cavitation began when pressure within the fast-moving water fell enough for vapor cavities to form. Those cavities then collapsed against the concrete surfaces. The collapse of one bubble was microscopic. The repetition of countless collapses was not. Concrete was torn from the tunnel surfaces. Cavities expanded. Rock and reinforcing material became exposed. The spillways were still moving water, but the pathway intended to protect the dam was damaging itself while it operated. The event became dramatic because the mechanism was partly hidden from view. At the surface, operators saw a reservoir approaching its limit and water entering the spillways. Inside the canyon walls, high-velocity flow was attacking the tunnels. The visible number was discharge. The hidden number was the pressure behavior inside that discharge. It was another version of the same pattern now appearing near minimum power pool. A large public measurement described what the water was doing. A smaller engineering variable determined what the infrastructure could survive. Temporary measures were used to protect the damaged spillways while operators managed the flood. Afterward, the tunnels required major repairs. Reclamation redesigned portions of the system and installed large aeration slots. These structures introduced air beneath the high-speed water, helping prevent the pressure conditions that had produced destructive cavitation. The lesson was absorbed into concrete. Engineers did not respond by declaring that the spillways had failed in every sense. The spillways had carried extraordinary flow and helped protect the dam, but their performance exposed a weakness that had not been adequately controlled. The correct response was not panic, it was redesign. 1983 and the low water years of the early 2020s are not identical events. They should not be presented as though one predicts the other. The 1983 crisis involved rapid inflow, a nearly full reservoir, spillway use, and destructive, high-velocity flow. The modern crisis involves reduced inflow, a low reservoir, declining hydraulic head, reduced hydropower, and growing dependence on lower outlet structures. In one case, operators needed to move more water through the dam than normal pathways could carry. In the other, they may need to continue moving required water after the most valuable pathway becomes unavailable. One event was a flood control problem. The other is a storage and release capacity problem. The direction is opposite. The structural lesson is the same. Rarely used pathways become critical when the primary operating range disappears. Once that happens, small design limits carry system-wide consequences. In 1983, the spillways were the weak point because too much water had to move too quickly. Near minimum power pool, the river outlet works become the weak point because required water may have to move through fewer openings with less pressure. The comparison does not prove that the outlet tubes will suffer the same damage as the spillways. Their geometry, operation, and hydraulic conditions are different. It proves something more careful and more useful. Backup infrastructure must be evaluated under the actual conditions in which it may be asked to become primary infrastructure. A structure used briefly during maintenance is facing one problem. The same structure used continuously during a prolonged low reservoir is facing another. Duration changes load. Frequency changes wear. Reduced hydraulic head changes discharge behavior. Loss of redundancy changes the consequence of taking one component offline. History also shows that the most dangerous assumption is often not a faulty calculation. It is the belief that tomorrow will remain inside the operating range of yesterday. Before 1983, the spillway tunnels existed and had been designed to carry enormous flows. The flood revealed a destructive mechanism inside that design. Before the 2021 and 2022 drought operations, upstream reservoirs existed as part of a coordinated storage system. The decline of Powell revealed that they might be needed to protect a specific elevation at another dam. Before Page and Lachie required a new intake connection, Lake Powell had supplied those communities through infrastructure built around higher water. The falling reservoir revealed that water can remain in a lake while becoming inaccessible to the equipment meant to deliver it. Each precedent moved the boundary between theoretical and operational risk. This is why the present warning does not depend on predicting a catastrophe. The evidence already establishes the mechanism. Low elevation has already reduced hydropower. Emergency operations have already been used to preserve Powell. Upstream storage has already been moved to protect critical infrastructure. Community water equipment has already been modified because previous intake assumptions became unreliable. And Glen Canyon Dam has already demonstrated that an alternative release pathway can develop serious problems when rare conditions force it into a central role. None of this proves that history will repeat in the same form. It proves that operating margin matters more than the appearance of the dam from outside. The concrete can look permanent, while the usable pathways change around it. The event in 1983 passed. The low point of 2023 also passed. But the evidence they left behind remains. When water moves outside the expected range, the system must depend on components that were previously secondary. And when secondary components become primary, the future of the dam is decided not only by how much water is present, but by how many safe, controllable ways remain to move it. That lesson now expands beyond Glen Canyon, because the next question is not whether one dam can survive another difficult year. It is whether an entire river basin can continue defending one critical structure by transferring pressure into every reservoir, power system, community, and agreement connected to it. This is not only a low reservoir event. It is a test of whether a river system built around stored abundance can operate when every major decision is made inside a shrinking margin. Glen Canyon Dam is where the pressure becomes visible, but the pattern extends from mountain snowfields to Lake Mead, from tribal water systems to agricultural districts, and from federal power contracts to the rules that divide the Colorado River among 7 states and Mexico. The system was designed to convert variability into reliability. Snow could be heavy one year and weak the next, but large reservoirs would store the difference. Powell and Mead would act like enormous savings accounts. Water captured during wet periods could be released during dry ones. Hydropower would help finance the system. Agreements would determine who received water and when. The calendar assumed that winter accumulation would lead to spring runoff. Spring runoff would rebuild storage, and storage would carry the basin through the next dry sequence. That calendar has not vanished, but it has become less dependable. Snow still falls, runoff still arrives, wet years still matter. The change is that the relationship between those stages has weakened. Warmer conditions can increase evaporation and soil moisture losses. A larger share of snowmelt can disappear before reaching the river. Dry years can remove storage faster than a single wet year restores it. The old cycle has not stopped. Its recovery phase has become less reliable. Lake Powell reveals that shift because it sits between the upper and lower basins. Water arriving from Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico enters the reservoir from above. Water released through Glen Canyon Dam moves toward Lake Mead and the lower basin below. Powell is therefore not merely a storage site, it is a hinge. When its elevation falls, managers cannot protect every part of the system independently. Holding more water in Powell supports hydraulic head and turbine operation, but it reduces the volume moving toward Mead during that period. Releasing more water supports Mead and downstream supply, but it lowers Powell and weakens Glen Canyon Dam. Sending additional water from Flaming Gorge can support Powell, but it draws down another reservoir. Purchasing replacement electricity can compensate for lost hydropower, but it transfers the cost into another institution. Every rescue creates a new location for pressure. This is not a failure of coordination. It is the physical result of trying to divide less margin among the same connected functions. For decades, the basin could often treat water delivery, hydropower, recreation, environmental flows, and reservoir protection as related but separately manageable objectives. Low storage compresses them into one decision. An acre-foot retained behind Glen Canyon Dam is also an acre-foot not released toward Mead at that moment. An acre-foot released through a turbine supports downstream delivery and produces electricity, but it also lowers the reservoir. An acre-foot sent from Flaming Gorge supports Powell, but no longer protects Flaming Gorge against its own future drought. The same water cannot occupy every protective role at once. The system pattern is therefore not simply shortage. It is competition among forms of security. The basin's operating rules were built to manage that competition, but many of the central rules now approaching replacement were created when the reservoirs held more water and the lowest elevations seemed less immediate. The current interim guidelines governing coordinated operations of Powell and Mead are scheduled to expire at the end of 2026. Federal agencies have been developing post-2026 guidelines intended to manage the reservoirs under a wider range of hydrology. The process examines different ways to coordinate releases, distribute shortages, protect critical infrastructure, and respond when either Powell or Mead approaches dangerous elevations. But the existence of new alternatives does not mean the basin has agreed on one future. Different proposals place responsibility in different places. Some emphasize reservoir elevations. Some emphasize total system storage. Some distribute reductions according to legal entitlements or patterns of use. Some seek stronger protection for critical infrastructure. The modeling can show how each strategy performs under thousands of possible hydrologic sequences. It cannot eliminate the conflict over who absorbs the reduction when there is not enough water to satisfy every expectation. That conflict is intensified by the difference between water allocated on paper and water available in the river. The Colorado River Compact and later agreements created a legal architecture for sharing the basin, but legal quantities do not cause snow to fall. They do not cool the soil. They do not reduce evaporation. They determine how scarcity is administered after hydrology has created it. When average river supply remains below the level of long-term demand, reservoirs can temporarily hide the imbalance by releasing stored water. Lake levels fall slowly enough that the system continues functioning. Then the storage cushion becomes smaller, and the hidden imbalance enters infrastructure. Turbines lose head. Intake pipes approach their lower limits. Outlet capacity becomes more important. The legal problem becomes mechanical. This is why minimum power pool is more than an engineering threshold. It is the point where the physical river begins rejecting assumptions that rules once made manageable. A document can specify a release. A compact can establish an obligation. A forecast can describe expected inflow. But water can move through Glen Canyon Dam only through structures that exist at fixed elevations. When the lake falls below the turbine intakes, no legal language can restore hydraulic head. Managers must work with the remaining outlets, the remaining storage, and the remaining time. The river does not negotiate with the design drawings. The system must adapt its promises to the pathways still available. That adaptation is already occurring through reduced releases, drought response operations, conservation agreements, revised forecasts, and planning for new operating rules. These actions show that institutions are responding. They also reveal how much effort is now required to preserve functions that once depended on a larger, natural, and engineered buffer. A healthy reserve absorbs uncertainty quietly. A depleted reserve requires visible intervention. The more often emergency tools are used, the more they begin to resemble ordinary operations. That creates another systemic risk. Measures intended to bridge a rare crisis can lose effectiveness if the crisis becomes persistent. Upstream reservoir releases can protect Powell for a period, but they cannot be repeated indefinitely without drawing down the reservoirs providing the water. Temporary conservation payments can reduce use, but they require funding and willing participants. Reduced releases can protect Powell, but Mead cannot be protected forever by receiving less. Infrastructure modifications can extend access to lower water, but they do not create new supply. Each tool buys time. None replaces the hydrology that the system is missing. This is the new baseline question. A new baseline does not mean every year will be dry or that runoff will decline in a straight line. The basin will continue to experience wet years, average years, and extremely dry years. The important change is the starting condition from which those years arrive. A dry year following full reservoirs is a management challenge. A similar dry year following decades of depleted storage can become an infrastructure emergency. A wet year that once would have been stored for future protection may now be used to refill deficits created earlier. The weather event may be temporary. The storage condition carries memory. Powell and Mead record not only the current year, but the accumulated balance of many previous years. That means recovery must now compete with ongoing demand. The reservoirs need enough inflow to replace current releases before they can rebuild storage. If the system receives 6 million acre-feet and releases 6 million, the elevation may stabilize, but the lost reserve does not return. A rising lake during spring can still end the water year with little net improvement. A strong snowpack can reduce immediate danger without restoring the operating cushion that once separated normal management from emergency response. The basin can survive the year while remaining vulnerable to the next one. The danger is not only the peak shortage, it is insufficient recovery between loads. That pattern affects the calendar of preparation. Reservoir decisions once made annually may require monthly revision. Power customers must plan replacement energy before turbine output disappears. Communities must lower intakes before water falls beyond existing pipes. Farmers must make planting decisions before final runoff is known. Environmental managers must anticipate how changed releases will affect river temperature and habitat. Tribal nations must participate in decisions that may shape water access for decades, even though many tribal rights remain unresolved or lack infrastructure for full use. The old planning calendar assumed time. Low storage removes it. Decisions must be made earlier, with less certainty and larger consequences. The risk also moves geographically. Protecting Powell can send pressure upstream to Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo Reservoir. Reducing Powell releases can send pressure downstream to Mead. Losing hydropower can send pressure into electricity markets far beyond the river. Restricting agricultural supply can affect food production and rural employment. Raising water and power costs can affect households that have never seen Lake Powell. The reservoir is the visible center, but the system pattern is migration. Scarcity moves through contracts, transmission lines, canals, municipal budgets, ecosystems, and family decisions. It searches for the place with the least capacity to absorb it. That place may not be the largest city or the largest dam. It may be a small utility with limited purchasing power, a tribal community waiting for infrastructure, a farmer operating on thin margins, or an endangered species dependent on a narrow range of river conditions. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. The Colorado River system has substantial engineering capacity, experienced operators, conservation potential, and institutions capable of changing rules. Recent interventions have demonstrated that coordinated action can preserve critical elevations. Demand can be reduced. Releases can be adjusted. Infrastructure can be modified. Wet periods can create opportunities for recovery, but adaptation becomes more difficult when every measure is used only after the margin has nearly disappeared. The central question is whether the basin will manage storage as a protected reserve or continue treating it as the last available supply. Glen Canyon Dam is exposing that decision in mechanical form. The lake level shows how much stored water remains. Turbine flow shows how much operating value remains inside that water. Outlet capacity shows how many pathways remain when the turbines are lost. Upstream releases show how much protection can be borrowed from somewhere else. Together, these signals describe a system no longer debating an abstract future. It is deciding which functions must be defended first. This is not just a drought. It is an operating calendar failure, an infrastructure test, and a recovery problem occurring at the same time. The future will not be defined by one forecast or one threshold crossing. It will be defined by whether the basin can rebuild margin before another dry sequence arrives, whether new rules reduce demand before emergency tools are exhausted, and whether the smallest weak points are strengthened before they inherit the weight of the entire river. That is the pattern Glen Canyon reveals. But one final boundary remains. The evidence is strong enough to justify action. It is not strong enough to justify every dramatic claim made about what happens next. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. Lake Powell is operating far below the elevations around which Glen Canyon Dam was designed to perform most effectively. Hydraulic head declines as the reservoir falls. Hydropower output can weaken before minimum power pool is reached. Emergency operating tools have already been used to protect critical elevations. Upstream reservoirs have already been asked to support Powell. Release plans have already been revised. Water supply infrastructure has already been modified because older intake assumptions no longer provided enough protection. These are observable facts. They establish that the system is under real stress, but they do not establish that every feared outcome will occur, that every cost increase can be traced to one dam, or that Lake Powell will cross a specific threshold on a date that cannot change. The evidence line begins by separating a risk from a prediction. A risk describes what can happen when known conditions align. A prediction claims to know when and how the alignment will occur. The first can be strong, even when the second remains uncertain. The current risk is clear. If inflow remains weak, if releases remain large relative to supply, and if emergency support is limited, Lake Powell can descend toward minimum power pool. As that happens, Glen Canyon Power Plant will have less hydraulic head, lower available generation, and a narrower operating range. If the lake falls below the turbine intake threshold, routine releases must rely on lower outlet structures that do not generate power and whose capacity also declines with elevation. Those relationships follow from the physical design of the dam. What remains uncertain is the sequence of weather, runoff, demand, policy, and intervention that determines how quickly the system moves through them. A wet winter could improve the outlook. A dry winter could worsen it. Reduced releases could protect Powell while transferring pressure toward Lake Mead. Conservation could reduce demand. New operating agreements could distribute shortages differently. Upstream support could create temporary protection, although it cannot continue without limit. Equipment modifications could extend operating capability. None of these possibilities should be ignored. Uncertainty does not mean the threat is imaginary. It means the future remains partly responsive to decisions and hydrology. The same discipline must be applied to climate attribution. Rising temperatures have contributed to greater evaporation, increased soil moisture losses, and reduced runoff efficiency across the Colorado River basin. Long-term warming has intensified the effect of precipitation shortages. But one weak runoff season cannot be explained by temperature alone. Snowfall patterns, storm tracks, soil conditions, wind, dust on snow, timing of melt, vegetation demand, and local precipitation all influence how much water reaches Lake Powell. Climate change shapes the background conditions and changes the probability of certain outcomes. It does not eliminate natural variability. A responsible account must hold both ideas at once. The basin is warming, and individual years still differ for many reasons. It is also important to separate minimum power pool from dead pool. They are not interchangeable. Minimum power pool is the approximate elevation below which normal hydropower generation through the turbines can no longer continue. Dead pool is much lower and refers to the point where gravity can no longer move water through the dam at historically useful rates because the reservoir has fallen near the lowest outlet structures. Reaching minimum power pool would be a serious operational event. It would not mean Lake Powell had become completely empty. It would not mean the Colorado River stopped at the dam. It would not mean every downstream user lost water immediately. Water could still pass through the river outlet works. The danger is that the system would lose a major release pathway, all associated hydropower, and a large amount of flexibility. That is serious enough without turning it into a false image of an empty canyon overnight. The evidence line also separates lower hydropower production from a regional blackout. Glen Canyon Dam is an important source of federal hydropower and grid flexibility. Losing part or all of that generation would require replacement power. It could increase costs and reduce operational options, especially during periods of high demand. But the Western electrical grid contains many power plants, transmission connections, markets, storage resources, and demand response tools. The loss of Glen Canyon generation would not automatically shut down the West. The credible risk is not instant darkness across several states. It is a more expensive and less flexible grid, facing one fewer controllable resource during already difficult conditions. That distinction does not weaken the warning. It makes the warning useful. Power planners can prepare for a resource shortfall. They cannot plan around an exaggerated claim that treats a complex grid as a single extension cord. The same caution applies to household bills. Reduced federal hydropower can increase replacement costs for utilities that depend on it. Those costs may reach customers, but the price on one family's bill also reflects fuel markets, transmission costs, local infrastructure, rate design, weather, debt, maintenance, and many other sources of electricity. It would be false to claim that one increase was caused entirely by Lake Powell. The honest statement is that declining Glen Canyon generation can remove a lower-cost resource and add pressure to customers who may already have little financial margin. It is one pathway among several, not the sole explanation for every hardship. Downstream water risk also requires precision. A reduced release from Powell can affect Lake Mead's storage trajectory. Yet the Colorado River is governed through annual plans, legal agreements, conservation programs, and coordinated operations. 1 month of lower flow does not translate directly into 1 month without water for a city. Large reservoirs delay and redistribute effects. That buffering is one of the system's strengths. It is also why problems can remain hidden for years. Storage can continue supporting deliveries while the reserve beneath those deliveries declines. The public may experience normal service while operators see the cushion disappearing. The absence of immediate disruption is not proof that the system is healthy. It may mean the reservoirs are still spending the protection accumulated in earlier years. There is another claim the evidence cannot support. It cannot support saying that the river outlet works are certain to fail if they become the primary release route. The outlets are engineered structures maintained and monitored by experienced operators. They have passed large flows in the past. Their use below minimum power pool is part of the dam's design. The concern is narrower. Greater dependence on fewer structures reduces redundancy. Prolonged operation creates different maintenance demands. Falling hydraulic head reduces capacity. If one component is unavailable, the consequences become larger because fewer alternatives remain. This is an infrastructure vulnerability, not proof of an inevitable mechanical failure. The difference matters because good risk analysis focuses on where margin is shrinking, not on inventing a dramatic failure without evidence. Nor does the precedent of spillway damage in 1983 prove that river outlet tubes will experience the same cavitation damage. The spillways and outlets have different designs, flow paths, and operating conditions. The 1983 event demonstrates that rare operating pathways can reveal hidden weaknesses when used under extreme load. It does not establish that every secondary pathway fails in the same way. The lesson is about testing assumptions, inspecting equipment, and preserving alternatives. History provides evidence of mechanism. It does not provide a script that the future must follow. What, then, is the strongest statement the evidence allows? Glen Canyon Dam is approaching a period in which operational capability may decline before the most famous threshold is crossed. The lake elevation is the public signal. Turbine flow, hydraulic head, available generation, unit condition, and outlet capacity are the deeper signals. Together, they show whether the dam can still move required water through multiple pathways while producing power and absorbing surprise. When those options narrow, the system becomes more sensitive to dry forecasts. Maintenance, heat-driven electricity demand, downstream release requirements, and delays in political agreement. No single factor needs to cause collapse. The risk grows because several manageable problems can arrive at the same weak point. That is why the story returns to the federal dashboard where it began. A revised line appears on the screen. The projected elevation moves. The planned release changes. An upstream reservoir is asked to contribute. A power marketer lowers expectations. An operator checks the available units. None of these actions looks like a disaster by itself. Together, they reveal a system working harder to preserve the conditions under which it can continue working. That is the abnormal pattern. The emergency is not always a sudden break. Sometimes it is the increasing amount of intervention required to prevent the break. The headline number remains 3,490 feet. It is important because it marks the approximate loss of normal turbine operation. But the future of Glen Canyon Dam will not be decided only on the day the reservoir crosses that elevation. It will be decided in the approach. It will be decided by how much water enters the basin, how much demand is reduced, how releases are coordinated, how much upstream storage can be protected, how early power customers prepare, and how well the outlet structures are maintained. It will be decided by whether new rules treat reservoir margin as a reserve to protect or as water available to spend until the last possible moment. The event will pass in one form or another. A wet sequence may raise the lake, a dry sequence may lower it. Operating plans will be revised again. The line on the chart will move, but the thing revealed by this period will remain. A system built around deep storage, reliable runoff, abundant hydraulic head, and long recovery time is being tested by conditions that provide less of all four. This is not just a reservoir threshold. This is a controlled flow capacity test. And the final question is no longer whether Glen Canyon Dam can hold back Lake Powell. The question is whether the Colorado River system can preserve enough safe pathways, enough usable pressure, and enough time to keep moving water after the old operating margin is gone.